So thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to the organizers, particularly Matt Stevens, and to all the staff here at Elizabeth Bay House. One of the wonderful pleasures of seeing this new field of research emerge has been the opportunity to connect with some new colleagues. And one of the real revelations for me has been finding out about the wonderful initiatives at Sydney Living Museums and elsewhere in Australia through Matt and through some of the other speakers that we'll be hearing today. My talk is going to be focusing mainly on English country houses as a museum type. But there are connections and applications across the whole range of historic houses, including some that are much more modest than the gigantic, lavish piles that I'll be talking about today. And there are lots of possibilities for mutual enrichment as we take the field forward, so I'm very grateful for this opportunity to connect with you all today. Music is a powerful tool for shaping emotion and environment, suggesting and inspiring action and coloring narrative. We're very adept at reading musical cues in film, television, and video games, and there have been some very intriguing efforts to deploy music in similar ways in cultural heritage contexts. But until recently, there's been virtually no study or writing about the use of music in heritage interpretation outside the musical museum sector, where there is a literature. But that really is the only place where there's been any study about how we can use music most effectively in museums. Similarly, in the domain of historic house museums, musical research and interpretation rarely figure, except in the particular instance of the composer house. The English country house is a striking case in point. Though the central importance of the country house in the history of art and architecture has long been understood, we're only recently beginning to recognize its musical significance. We're starting to understand how the country house linked London to the provinces and how it anchored regional and provincial music networks supporting the flow of performers, composers, music teachers, instrument builders in both directions between the capital and the regions. Musical activity was an important aspect of living in many country houses, as we can see in formal and informal images of country house residents at music. And in accounts of country house life in letters, journals, and fiction. Even the walls show us this. This is the Bridgeman family at music in their music temple with Handel looking down, the bust of Handel looking down on them from above at Weston Park. This portrait of Rachel Lyde hangs at the Vine, her son's house, with her clutching her sheet music there. This Grand Tour portrait of the brother of the Duchess of Buccleuch, who inherited Boughton, shows him with a Corelli score in his guitar under his arm. So these people chose to portray themselves at music, the people who lived in these houses. It was important to them. We also have informal images like this one, a little watercolor made by a young girl of informal dancing with one of her family members playing the square piano and others dancing. As new patterns of entertaining took hold in the 18th century, this kind of musical activity was increasingly provided with dedicated spaces when building new country houses and when remodeling old ones. So we have things like the music room out in the garden at Weston Park, the Temple, the music room, the beautiful Robert Adam music room at Kettleston in Derbyshire, the music room inside at West Wickham Park, and the music temple outside on an island in the lake at the same house. They had to have two. Many country houses have instruments with provenance to the house, and some retain imposing collections of musical scores collected by former residents. Killerton House in Devon is wonderful because it has the house organ, the instrument that Lydia Ackland, who is playing that actual piano in that Singleton portrait, and her music all in the same place. But you can't hear a note of it if you go to this house. None of it. Despite all this evidence of the importance of music, all of the material evidence that remains, it's fair to say that until relatively recently, understanding of music in country houses lagged far behind research in art and architecture. And it's still the case that visitors rarely gain insights into music's important role in many properties' pasts. Where music figures in display, it's usually as a silent aspect of room dressing, and where sound is used, it often figures as a general ambient effect rather than a tool to evoke specific times and places and the uses that form a residence made of music in those places. This is partly the fault of musicologists, because until relatively recently, we really didn't pay very much attention to this kind of music. For much of the 20th century, composer-centered studies of Austro-German repertory dominated the scholarly landscape, and British music was left largely in the shade. So a lot of the music that's left in these houses was by British composers. Not all of it, some of it is by Austro-German composers, but because it wasn't close to the composers, they were not sources that were closely associated with Mozart or Haydn. They were always just left, because that was the way that we approached the field 50 years ago. But more recently, Simon McVeigh's pioneering studies of London concert life have shown how important London was to the international music picture in that period. And there have been some very fine recent studies of provincial music in Britain by people like Rachel Cowgill and Peter Holman. But country houses are almost always left out of this picture, the provincial picture, in favor of public events like music festivals and music meetings. And this is another problem of the historiography, in that music historians until relatively recently tended to think of domestic music as the province of unskilled amateurs, and music produced for that market as the work of unprincipled hacks. Unless it was by Haydn, in which case you called it a trio sonata or a string trio, whereas if it was by Kozeluk, you called it an accompanied sonata or salon music. See, the chamber music, salon music divide is something that is vocabulary, but it absolutely didn't apply in the 18th century. All of this music was intended for playing in domestic surroundings rather than giant concert halls. Professional musicians played in domestic settings. They often stayed in country houses. So this kind of problem of the domestic we're starting to get over now in musicology. Historians, that is, those who work in history departments rather than music departments, long ago exploded the notion of a strict separation between public and private, and the notion of separate spheres, and musicology is now caught up. So we're starting to pay attention. We're starting to understand that it's a mistake to backdate modern notions of domesticity, professionalism, amateurism into 18th and 19th century contexts. And so academic research into domestic music practice has been flourishing in recent years, including work on country houses. So now to the kind of early work that we had from Caroline Wood on Burton Constable in Yorkshire. There's been a recent thesis by Jane Troughton on other Yorkshire country houses, including at Castle Howard, Harwood House, Temple Newsome, and Nostell Priory, who have magnificent music collections. At Southampton, recent PhD theses by Penelope Cave, Lena Rana, and Katrina Faulds, who we'll be hearing from later, have explored collections at Killerton House, Tatton Park in Cheshire, and Wendy Stafford has a thesis in progress on Park in West Sussex. Martin Perkins is currently working on houses in the Midlands, including Weston Park and Cork Abbey. So all of this stuff is going on in individual houses, and we also are now in a position to start doing some international comparisons, thanks to Carol Mullaney Dignam's work on Irish houses, Rosemary Richards' work on the McRae Homestead in Victoria, Georgiana McRae's collection, Jenny Gall's projects that we'll be hearing about later for ACT Historic Places, and the things that Matt Stevens has been doing here at Vaucluse House and other properties in New South Wales. But despite all this, there is still an awful lot of unexploited material in country houses in Britain. And this focus on digging into individual houses, which had to come first, we had to figure out what was in these individual houses first, means that the bigger picture hasn't really emerged very clearly yet. And while we're starting to make international comparisons, these comparisons have thrown up as many questions as they have answers. Questions that are new and fascinating, like the representation of Scottishness and Irishness across the Anglophone world. We'll be hearing from Brianna a little bit about some of those kinds of things. How music published in London or Dublin made it across international boundaries to shape understandings of family life in new colonial and post-colonial contexts. So these things are all just starting to happen as very exciting new developments. If musicologists have ignored country houses until relatively recently, curators, on their part, often feel unequipped to deal with musical materials, intimidated by the specialist demands of notation, or just exhausted by the huge piles of uncatalogued sheet music and other stuff lying around in the houses they curate. But even when the musical history of a house and its collections has been thoroughly studied, the question of what to do with that knowledge remains. Frequently, the first impulse is to schedule one or more concerts. And here a number of philosophical and practical obstacles arise. Most domestic environments are completely unsuited to formal concerts. That's not what happened in domestic settings. Lack of space or curatorial concerns usually preclude having large audiences, making it difficult to fund the fees of top-flight professional musicians through ticket sales. Houses often need to rely instead on volunteer or local effort, and that means sometimes that specialist early music knowledge of appropriate repertoires and performance practices can be lacking. It's quite common in National Trust properties in Britain to, wander through and to have an 18th century Broadwood being used to play Satie, for example. It just happens all the time. And it's because that's what the volunteer who can play a little bit of piano can play. And so that's what happens. And it's wonderful because people hear the sound of the instrument, but it's not particularly revealing of the kind of music making that ever happened in that space or with that instrument. Perhaps most importantly, most of the music cultivated in country houses was never intended for the kind of passive listening practice that today's concert protocols involve. People didn't sit in rows and listen to music in their houses. That's not what they did with it. So the challenge is, how do you help visitors who may lack musical literacy themselves to interact with that music in a way that is somehow reminiscent of the domestic environment in which that music was cultivated in the past. So this whole situation is what led to the formation of Sound Heritage, which is a research and interpretation network of academic music historians, early music performance experts, and heritage professionals, both from the curatorial side and the visitor experience domain. And it was founded to put our heads together to address some of these problems. The goals are to first add to our somewhat fuzzy knowledge of music and musical practice in historic houses, so there is a fundamental research aim, and to think about new ways, once we've gathered that knowledge, of deploying it in historic houses so that these spaces sound for modern visitors in informative and stimulating ways. And the advantage of this collaborative approach include, for music researchers, better understanding of the specific role of the house and its material setting and its history in the history of music and musical culture, so that we can learn from our curatorial colleagues about everything else that surrounded the music that we are researching. For historians of domestic buildings and for curators, better knowledge of the role of music in architecture, in decoration, in social life, and about the links of music, sounding music, to objects, which helps to enrich the understanding of connections between tangible and intangible heritage. And then for the interpretation, visitor experience side of historic houses, understanding music as an important activity for former residents and evoking this activity to help with peopling the properties in visitors' minds. Sound and music can act as a very powerful antidote to the static sense that historical settings can create for some audiences, and music can also provide possibilities for interaction on site, for events that can generate repeat visits, including from local visitors who may have already been before, but who you want to cultivate as regular footfall. And it can also help with virtual visits via recording and film, because music lends itself so well to multimedia. So luckily the AHRC agreed that these were all good things to do, and they gave us money to found the Sound Heritage Network, and gave us 18 months of funding to kick it off with a series of 3 study days, during which we came up with a series of priorities about the kinds of things that the network wants to do. One thing is to start a census of musical materials in British and Irish country houses, because we don't even know what's in them for the most part. We've just completed a pilot study in just the Yorkshire houses, which will then go into Cecilia, which is the online catalogue of music holdings in Britain and Ireland. And we've learned from that, hoping to roll it out across all of Britain and Ireland, so you will be able to then get a complete picture of all the material that's in historic houses that's available for research and study. We're preparing a resources guide for curators to aid in researching the musical history of specific properties. And we were asked by all of our curatorial colleagues and visitor experience colleagues for case studies. That's what they wanted the most, things that they could look at for inspiration and models, and to avoid making mistakes that we'd made in some of our early experiments. So all of these things are being made available through the Sound Heritage website. So if you put that in your favorites, you can go and see what we're up to. We have a very active Facebook group that I encourage you all to join if you haven't done it already. And then when we put up new projects and new news and things like that about the exciting stuff that's going on, you'll be kept up to date. So in the remainder of my time, I wanted to just walk you through a few case studies of things that we've done with particular properties to make some of this feel a little bit more concrete, because it all sounds great in the abstract, and then you try to implement it with a particular research in a particular collection, an interpretation in a particular property, and then all the practical problems arise and the difficulties happen. So one of the case studies, this is the oldest one on the site because it actually predates the foundation of the network, and it was one of the sets of experiments that we did as we were trying to find our way to what needed to be done. And it happened at Tatton Park in Cheshire. This is a neoclassical mansion that was built for the Edgerton family to designs by Samuel Wyatt and Lewis William Wyatt, and it's owned by the National Trust and managed by Cheshire East Council. It's just outside Manchester. It's one of the National Trust's most complete estates. It has an outstanding collection of furniture by Gillows of Lancaster that was made for the house, and one of the most important libraries owned by the Trust. It's huge and has incunabula going back to the 16th century. Very, very fine 18th century collection as well. The music collection here includes approximately 50 binders volumes and other bound scores, and a considerable amount of unbound sheet music just in piles that were in cupboards in various places that we kept tripping across, as the project kind of went on. They say, oh, there's this. We go, oh, really? That too. The bulk of this music belonged to Elizabeth Edgerton, who was born Elizabeth Sykes and who grew up at Sledmere in Yorkshire. She brought her music collection, and you see some of her bound volumes there, the spines, Most of it was purchased when she was a schoolgirl in London, those green volumes. Her later volumes, after she was married, are bound in black. And she brought these volumes with her to the house when she married her cousin Wilbraham Egerton in 1806. A 1789 Kirkman harpsichord in the house probably also came with her from Sledmere, we think, possibly. And the house has this very opulent music room that was designed by Lewis William Wyatt and completed in 1819. And research on this house began via a long-term collaboration between the Department of Music at the University of Southampton, my institution, and the National Trust. And again was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council of Great Britain. After I started working in this house and had been working in it for a bit, it turned out there was way too much for one person to look at. And we were lucky enough to get 2 PhD studentships from the AHRC in collaboration with the National Trust, and then we're funded by the university and the Menzies Trust here in Australia for a 3rd studentship. So there were 4 of us working in this house for a period of about 4 or 5 years. I can't overemphasize how fruitful that particular collaboration was. Putting together the National Trust with the university unlocked sets of funding from both sides that wouldn't have been available to us otherwise, and it's a very, very good model to follow. When we came to interpret all this research, my articles, the 3 theses that the PhD students were working on, the repertory they're playing, because 2 of them are very, very, very fine performers, as you'll hear later on today, we had to take account of a number of important constraints. Tatton Park is fully furnished, and the music room, as you can see, does not allow visitors through except on a very narrow space around the original 18th century carpet. It's just not possible to do performances in there. The Copula Hall has a sprung dance floor, and it has some space for seating, but not much. There are some unfurnished rooms upstairs, which you can fit people into, but they're not disabled accessible. The tenants' hall can hold about 100, 150 people, but it's separate from the main core of the house where all of the historical materials actually are, so it's not so great either. So to address these issues, we did a bunch of small-scale interactive experiments and multimedia experiments to see if we could transcend the problems of space with this particular house and the physical limitations. And the first one of these was staged in collaboration with the Royal Northern College of Music. Again, hooking up with a conservatoire is a great thing to do because there's lots of musical expertise and performance expertise to draw upon. This was part of Tatton Park's week of special Christmas openings in December 2011. Students from the RNCM performed in the house daily. And then midweek, we had a special day-long event that involved a closed workshop in the morning where the PhD students from Southampton worked with the student performers from the RNCM to introduce them to the books and manuscripts in the collection. And then we had an open masterclass in the afternoon where historical performance practice, vocal and keyboard experts worked with the students in a space very like this in the Copula Hall, which had ropes in the doorways so that visitors could circulate around as the workshop was happening. So it was a 2-hour masterclass that just happened as if it was in the conservatoire, but plopped in the middle of the Copula Hall. And I do have a bit of a video of part of it. This is Richard Wistrike, who was then now at the Royal College of Music in London, now at it was then at the RNCM, explaining to some people who happened to be wandering through what we were up to. And so this is what we did. We just kind of stopped every now and again and said, this is what we're doing. These are students. And so, and it was all very, very informal. There was lots of stopping and chatting. That's Harvey Davies from the Royal Northern, who is a research fellow in performance there and historical keyboard. you can see this is just an amateur video. One of us took it, and so it's not great quality, sound quality or visual, but you get the idea. There were people circulating around. It was very, very laid back. About 500 visitors came through during this week, and of the 320 who responded to the exit surveys, 58 of them identified the live music as the most enjoyable aspect of their visit to Tatton Park. And several commented that they really enjoyed the kind of behind-the-scenes look at seeing the students learn. They really enjoyed it not being a formal concert and seeing how the students put their performances together. So that was an interesting takeaway from that particular experiment. A second experiment that we did featured in the context of the Tatton Park Biennial, which is a major contemporary art show. Its third edition, which was on the theme Flights of Fancy, ran from May to September of 2012. And this event featured new site-specific commissions for both the mansion and the park, some very large-scale outdoor artworks, as well as commissions for inside the house from a range of international artists. For this particular edition of the biennial, we persuaded the curators that it would be a good idea to commission something for the music room, and the Southampton research team acted as consultants for this piece. The artist Ora Zatz was commissioned to produce this response to the music room, and she did this piece, Sound Ornaments in the Music Room, which read the theme Flights of Fancy as ornament, so fancy in the sense of ornament. And she used extended close-up tracking shots of the ornament around the mirrors, on the furniture, inlaid into the keyboard instruments of the music room for a 7-minute film. To a score by Larry Goves, a Southampton PhD composer who teaches at the Royal Northern College of Music, who used manuscript ornamentation from Elizabeth Sykes' music books to create the score by stretching them out in the same kind of musical procedure as the close-up tracking shots of the film. And the film was projected on a brass plate mounted in the fireplace with hidden projector and hidden speakers, so that it looked as if the music was coming out of the fireplace. So that's one shot of it, and that's another. So as you walked in the room, it was just this kind of ghostly thing happening in the fireplace. It was very cool. And this is just a little snippet of the film itself with the tracking shots, and so you get an idea. The score has this kind of microtonal thing going on in the background, and then we're going to get the ornaments looping over the top. But I'll leave the film running so you can see it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. The relationship between the film, the installation, and the musical materials that it was based on and the architecture of the music room was explained in a separate exhibition that happened in the exhibition hall of the house that was produced by the Tatton Park house staff and volunteers. And they also produced some materials that went into the family pack that went out to visitors during the show. This Tatton Park Biennial had 280,000 visitors over the summer between May and September, of whom 37,680 visited the music room. So thank you, National Trust, for counting them all. And it was very widely covered in general and specialist art media outlets. And some of the reviews in the international art media specifically singled out this piece for its very close relationship to the house and its history. For the biennial's closing event in September, so this installation ran all summer, and if you visited the house, you saw it. But we also did a special closing event for the end of the show that featured live music making, again with a blend of contemporary music, contemporary commissions, with repertoire from the collection itself. There were 3 new commissions. One of them was called Visual Score. It was a collaboration between Orazats and the contemporary harpsichordist Jane Chapman. And Jane and the Playel Ensemble also played premieres of works by Larry Goves and another composer, Leo Grant, and mixed it in with historic music from the collection. Leo Grant's piece was actually a mashup of 2 arias by Handel that figured in the collection with ornaments by Elizabeth Sykes that starts out feeling like Handel pastiche and then turns into something completely weird and wonderful. It's a very, very, very fabulous piece. Visual Score, this is one of some of the guitar music that happened in the library. Visual Score featured a paper scroll that unrolled from the cupula. Orazats was up in the cupula space, very similar to this, and the harpsichord was down in the hall, and it unrolled as the piece happened, and that was very beautiful also, really, really interesting thing. Different pieces in this event kicked off at different times in different rooms of the house. So we had some contemporary guitar music and guitar music from a guitar manuscript in this collection in the library. We had the cupula hall, we had stuff upstairs, we had stuff all around. And the audience of 70 was a kind of crossover mix between people who were there for the biennial, new music audiences who came for the premieres, and a bunch of people who just happened to be in Cheshire that day who stumbled across Tatton Park and went, whoa, what's going on? We got some really good written feedback from this event, which I can share with you for those who are interested. And then finally, last thing at Tatton Park, in 2013, the HRC, bless them, came through again and gave us money through their Cultural Engagement Fund to produce a series of documentary films about music in this house. So we decided to do 4 short films that would be general enough to be usable in any country house of this vintage, late 18th, early 19th century, but would be filmed at Tatton Park. So that was the idea. Each of the 4 films explored a different theme, and each one was filmed in a different room. So we have the cherry-colored music and dining rooms, drawing rooms for an overview of the collection. We used the yellow drawing room for a thing on music lessons and music teaching in the period. We used the cupula hall for dance because we know that this room was used for dancing and has a sprung dance floor. And we used the library for a thing on collecting music as an aspect of collecting. We were able to arrange the loan of an 1822 Broadwood grand piano for the music room, which is a much better instrument for that room, so that we could move the harpsichord into the library where we think it was. There's an 1820 watercolor, and we think that that's that harpsichord. We think. It's close enough. We hope. Anyway, we consulted with the house staff about this, and they were very keen that costumes and historical scenes should figure in these films because they felt that it was a better way to engage with audiences. So the Tatton Park Trust provided funding for us to consult with historical film costumiers and to put some historical scenes into with the talking heads. So it kind of tracks between us talking about the collection and then scenes of what people would have done in these spaces, costume scenes. These films are currently available through YouTube on the Tatton Park website and through the Sound Heritage website. And I was explaining to people last night at dinner that we had to prepare the scripts, the scores, the still images, and everything for these films over 3 months, only 3 months, and film them in only 2 days, 4 films. It was insane. We'll never want to do that again, so that's something we learned that you should never do. But I think they kind of turned out okay, so I'll just play a snippet beginning of one of them so you can see how they came out. When we visit country houses today, we can still get an idea of what they looked like in the past. But it's much harder to understand how they sounded. Today, the houses are alive with the sound of visitors and staff, but one crucial element is often missing: music. We're going to explore music's hidden history here at Tatton Park in Cheshire to find out how the people who used to live here used music to create their home. Both family members and professional musicians performed here, and there was a huge range of music making. From solo practice sessions, to lessons with visiting teachers, informal music making with the family, to private concerts and balls for invited guests, and even large-scale festivities for the local community. Tatton Park even has a lavishly decorated music room, an entire space devoted to the idea and practice of making music. Dedicated music rooms are... So I'll stop that there. So these are the experiments that we did at Tatton. They helped us to learn a lot about what you can and can't do, gave us lots of ideas for the future. So just in closing, I'll show you a couple of slides about some of the things we're doing now in 2 properties in Hampshire. One of them is this one, Mottisfont, where the very noted collector of harpsichords, Raymond Russell, who's probably one of the most important 20th century collectors of historic instruments of all, grew up. Who knew? The National Trust contacted us because of the Tatton Park work, and this is a good illustration of how this kind of stuff can spread once you start making contacts across the academic and heritage sector borders. The curator from the Northwest moved to the South and London, and when Mottisfont said, "We'd love to do something about Raymond Russell and harpsichords, but we don't know what to do," he said, "Aha, I know some people at Southampton who can help you." And so what we've done is we've found this harpsichord that we've loaned to the house. It's an instrument they can use. We've created some workshops to train volunteers in how to display it. We've obtained copies of all of Raymond Russell's books for the boys' room, where a harpsichord did actually live in Raymond Russell's time. We figured out that there's... so we have 2 PhD students, Kate Haunt and Christopher Lewis, who are working in this house, and they're turning up amazing amounts of information. Chris has made training videos to show people how to take the jacks out, to show so that visitors, even when volunteers are there who don't have any specific musical training, they can still show the harpsichord and share it with visitors. We're training some of the musically adept visitors to do some basic tuning and maintenance, and we've been organizing recitals and talks there. So all of this, there's some stuff on the website available. The newest thing, and this just launched this week, is at the Vine in Hampshire, where we've just completed an immersive soundscape. This chapel is one of the very few surviving pre-Reformation private chapels in England. It was built between 1515 and 1520. It has its original stalls and stained glass and tiles. So it's an amazing survival. But only 10 people can fit into it at a time, and the stalls are too fragile for anybody to walk in them. And the problem at the Vine currently is that the roof is leaking, and they've had to, there's a multi-million project to replace the roof, and they've had to close the whole top of the house, including the Tudor Long Gallery, which is what most people go there for. So the Vine Roof project is about spotlighting other parts of the house that still remain open, and of those, the chapel is the most significant. So what we've done here is to create this 3D soundscape of a lady mass as it would have occurred during Henry VIII's visit to this house, his 4th. He visited several times. In October 1535, he came with Anne Boleyn and stayed for 4 days with his chapel singers. So all of the polyphony, the chant, everything, the movement of people through the space, footsteps, sitting down, standing up, the swing of the chain of the incense, everything has been redone, recreated in a chapel in Oxford, recorded and installed in with a multi-speaker array, so that you can go into the chapel. If you walk towards the altar, you can hear that the priests are celebrating while behind you the polyphony is going on. If you walk over here, you'd hear the person sit down next to you, the choir singer. If you walk over that way, you hear the footsteps of the person walk by. It's extraordinary. It's very, very cool. There's lots of stuff online about this right now because it launched on the 22nd of March. And it's featuring in Tune this week on Radio 3, Radio 4, and it's been on the national news in the UK. So there's lots of stuff to find out about this. And within the next couple of weeks, we'll have the soundscape up online so that you can hear snippets of it. It's pretty magnificent. So that's what we're up to at the moment, onwards and upwards. We've got some projects coming up at Lime Park as well that probably won't debut until 2018. Thank you very much for all of this. I'm very happy to answer questions about this or any other if we have time, and to let you know more if you want to. Thank you.